Last week, we looked at the story of Ruth and saw how Ruth came to be the daughter-in-law of Naomi. How it began with a fateful journey to Moab by Elimelech and Naomi and their two sons. And how once they get to Moab, Elimelech and the sons die after their sons marry some Moabite women. And Naomi's faithful return to Judah, accompanied by Ruth. We noticed the noble choice that was made by Ruth to leave her homeland and her God for that matter, in favor of adopting Naomi's home and Naomi's God as her own. And we looked at the very exciting and wonderful expression of friendship that Ruth expresses to Naomi in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. Now, noteworthy throughout the entire story of Ruth, not just the first chapter, but throughout the entire story, noteworthy is Ruth's devotion to her mother-in-law. We saw it in her noble choice, and we see it again in her lowly service. Chapter 2 picks up where chapter 1 left off in the story. Let's go ahead and read. It's about the time of the barley harvest. And it says, "Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, 'Let me go into the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor.' And she said to her, 'Go, my daughter.' So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered, 'The Lord bless you.' Then Boaz said to his young man, who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?' And the servant, who was in charge of the reapers, answered, 'She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early in the morning until now, except for a short rest." Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her the roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The man's name with whom I worked today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young women until they have finished all my harvest.' And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted.' So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law." In this chapter, as we look at Ruth's lowly service, we understand, first of all, that Ruth works in the fields of Boaz. But before she did, she requested to work in the fields. Notice the first person that before we're even told about that, though, we're introduced to Boaz. He is a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech, and a man of great wealth. And really, that's all we're told right now. It's sort of a foreshadowing sort of statement, verse 1 is. To say, and Elimelech had this relative named Boaz, and we'll get back to him a little bit later on in the story. But Ruth asked permission from Naomi first to let her work in the fields. Remember, Ruth is a Moabite, and she may not have been familiar with the way things worked in Israel. And so she asked her mother-in-law, who would be familiar with how things worked in Israel, about how she could go about helping gather food for her and for Naomi. And so she asked Naomi, hoping to find favor or kindness from a landowner. And really, Ruth doesn't know what she's asking Naomi, but this was really all settled well before Ruth even came into Israel. You see, the law forbid owners from reaping the corners of their fields or from gathering the leftovers. Leviticus 19, verses 9 and 10 say that. Now what that means is that the corners and anything that was left over that they missed or whatever as they went by on their first pass, that was to be reserved for those less fortunate than the landowner. In this way, God provided for strangers, for the fatherless, and for widows, Deuteronomy 24, verses 19 through 22. Now, perhaps, though, this being the period of the Judges, where Judges 21:25 tells us everyone did it, there was no king in Israel, everyone did as he saw fit. Perhaps maybe the landowners didn't exactly follow this law, this part of the law. They maybe didn't respect it, especially towards strangers. Because as I said, remember, this is the period of the Judges. And that stranger who is quote-unquote poor and destitute and in need of help, that comes and gleans in your field and picks up some of your grain and things of that nature, that stranger could very well the next day be an oppressor. And so, there were possibly some landowners who didn't respect that. Yet we are reminded in the book of Ruth 6 times that Ruth was a Moabite. And you do remember the Moabites were one of the oppressors that God sent during the period of the Judges. 6 times we're reminded that she's a Moabite, and in fact 3 of those times are right here in chapter 2. I think it's a pretty big deal. So Ruth happened to be in a field of Moab, or comes on a field belonging to Boaz, picking up after the reapers as the law allowed. I like how the NIV puts it, as it turns out, she was in the field of Boaz. But some people don't really like phrasing things like that, as it turned out, or she happened to be in the field of Boaz, because they say, well, that makes it sound like it was all thanks to chance, that it was all just sort of, luckily she happened to be in the field of Boaz rather than in somebody else's field. But really, even with those words in the text, really, if you keep this story in the overall context of the book of Ruth and the story of Ruth, we know good and well luck had nothing whatsoever to do with this. This was providence. This was God's providence directing Ruth to the field that belonged to Boaz. So, Boaz then comes on the scene, and he inquires about the strange woman in the fields. He's seen women in the fields before and everything, and that's all well and good, but he notices someone different. And so he asks, when he comes up onto his field, we immediately see the respect that Boaz has between his workers and the workers have for Boaz. Boaz shows up and he wishes the Lord's presence on them. In return, they wish the Lord's blessing on him. And we see a healthy employer-employee relationship. Perhaps a model for how we as employers should treat our employees and how we as employees should treat our employer. But anyway, so Boaz asked his foreman about the strange woman in the field that he hadn't seen before, who relates to her Moabite background and her relation to Naomi. And who says, and by the way, she's a good worker. I mean, she's got here early in the morning and she's been working steadily since. She took a short break, but really, she's been working hard. So now with Boaz aware of Ruth's identity, we next learn how Boaz extends kindness to Ruth. And his initial kindness is noteworthy. Boaz encourages her to work in his field only. He tells her, hey, don't go in any other person's field. You stay in my field and in the fields that belong to me and close to my servant girls. And he also says, and by the way, know that the young men who are working here have been told not to touch you. And I think that says an awful lot about the morality of Israel during the period of the Judges. Remember, everyone did what he saw fit in his own eyes. They didn't have a king. They did what they wanted to do. And if you were in the field and you saw a good lady, you just did what you wanted to. And it didn't. He says, I've told my workers not to touch you. I've told them not to do anything to you. So that tells you a little bit about the status of Israel's morals in this particular time period. But furthermore, he says, if you get thirsty, go up and get a drink. Normally, a stranger who was in the fields following the reapers was not allowed to approach the reapers, was not allowed to get close enough to the people who were working the field for the landowner to get a drink. Yet he says, you just go up there, you get as much as you need. So Ruth inquires as to why he's being so kind to her. I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, she knows that something special is going on here, and she's getting special treatment, but she doesn't know exactly why. So she asks, and Boaz tells her that he's heard of her devotion to Naomi. He's heard about her noble choice that we talked about last week. And Boaz prays that the Lord will bless her in return for seeking his refuge. Maybe Boaz sees her being in his field as an opportunity to be God's agent in blessing her and Naomi. See, people don't just happen to come into our lives. A lot of times they're put there on purpose. A lot of times God's providence directs them into our lives. And we can either see ourselves as just too busy to notice, or we can see ourselves as being God's agent in blessing that person's life. Boaz saw himself as God's agent in blessing Ruth and Naomi's life. And Ruth is comforted by his kindness. Verse 13 tells us she hopes to continue to find favor in his sight, and for his kindness toward one who's not even one of his servant girls. She's amazed by how kind he is. But his initial kindness was one thing, but then there was also his extended kindness that he shows to her, shown to her at the noontime meal. when they eat what we call lunch or dinner, whatever you want to call it, Boaz invites her to eat with the rest of the workers. Okay, again, this isn't something that was normally done for the people who were following after, picking up the leftovers and the scraps. This wasn't the way it was supposed to be. Yet he has her come up. Not only does he have her come up there, but he passes to her the roasted grain for her to eat. Allows her to eat as much as she needs and satisfies herself, and then she has some left over, and he lets her take it home with her. He's being extremely nice to her. It's also shown in his instructions to his workers. He tells them, let her glean among the sheaves, and don't yell at her, don't get upset with her. See, the poor, the widows, the fatherless, etc., they were to follow behind the reapers. They weren't to get out in the standing grain, but they were to get to the stuff that fell or just didn't get harvested by the workers. He tells them, hey, if she gets out in the stuff that's still the good stuff that we haven't been to yet, don't worry about it. In fact, not only that, he tells her, he tells his workers, by the way, as you're going along and you're bundling stuff up, leave a few out for her to get. And don't be as thorough as maybe you should be. Let stalks fall from the bundles for her to pick up. All this together allows Ruth to reap an ephah of barley. That's a rather large amount for one person to pick up from quote-unquote scraps. You might say, well, wait a second, an ephah, I'm not familiar with that. Well, everyone knows that an ephah is roughly 10 omers. Right? Everybody knows that, right? Yeah, well, what's an omer? An omer is the amount of manna each Israelite was to pick up per day when manna fell in the wilderness. So this one day, Ruth's picked up 10 days worth of food, we might say. Putting it in language we can understand, this is roughly 3/5 of a bushel of scraps, of leftovers. That's pretty amazing if you think about it. But then again, she had a lot of help from the clumsy workers who were dropping stuff for her to pick up, right? So anyway, at the end of the day, Ruth returns back to the city where she goes to her mother-in-law, and Naomi responds with great joy. First of all, she's fed by Ruth's excess. The leftovers she had from lunch, Ruth shares her food with Naomi, the roasted grain, showing her mother-in-law what she was able to gather, her mother-in-law being excited and amazed by how much she was able to have. The leftovers from earlier they enjoy. Ruth not only shares her food with Naomi, she shares some information with Naomi as well. She says how she was able to gather so much, prompting Naomi to wonder about all of these events. And Naomi's wondering about all of this goodness that has been shown to her actually is a good thing, because Naomi then rejoices over God's kindness. In response to Naomi's questions, Ruth tells her about Boaz. And Naomi blesses the Lord for his kindness to the living and to the dead, and for Boaz being a close relative who would have a duty to preserve the name of the dead relative. I want you to notice the contrast at the end of chapter 1 with Naomi and right now. At the end of chapter 1, when they get back to Bethlehem, they say, hey, it's Naomi. And she says, no, don't call me Naomi. Naomi means pleasant. Call me Mara. Call me bitter, because the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. And yet now she's beginning to see God blessing her and blessing Ruth. Quite a contrast in the way that she was feeling. And then Naomi encourages Ruth to continue, counsels Ruth to continue to do what she's been doing. Ruth tells of Boaz's instructions to her to not go anywhere else, to stay in his fields, to not try to go somewhere else where she could be hurt, but to stay with his servant girls and all. And Naomi encourages her to stay with it, to comply with Boaz's instructions, which Ruth does until the end of the harvest, while she's living with Naomi. In this chapter, we notice two noteworthy examples of righteous character. First, you have Ruth, whose humility and willingness to work, minister to the needs of her mother-in-law. She was the guest. She wasn't the Israelite. She was there as a favor to Naomi, and she could have said, well, Naomi should be taking care of me. But instead of having that attitude and that type of an outlook, instead, Ruth decided she wanted to serve Naomi and continue to serve Naomi. And then, of course, the second example we see of righteous character is Boaz, in his kindness and sense of propriety in his treatment of the foreign woman in his field. Now, we see those two great examples of righteous conduct and righteous character, and we can't help but think, wow, wouldn't it be something special if those two ended up together? Well, if you read ahead in the story, you find out that is what happens, but we'll talk about that over the next couple of weeks. But in addition to that righteous character of Ruth and of Boaz, we also see Naomi's faith in God being reassured. Even though she believed that her earlier loss was due to God's discipline, she understands and she's comforted and convinced that God had totally turned his back on her earlier. Now she's saying, well, maybe he hasn't. In this story of Ruth's lowly service, we see another truth displayed. That truth is that God gives grace to the humble. Just as we read in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 through 7. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. Are we willing to provide lowly service to those around us? Are we willing to humble ourselves before the Lord? And are we willing to wait on him to lift us up? See, that's where it all starts. It starts with a willingness to serve. Ruth was willing to serve, even though she could have thought that Naomi was supposed to take care of her. She didn't. Instead, she wanted to help take care of Naomi. And as a result, some pretty exciting things are going to happen. And we'll get to those next week in our study of Ruth. But for right now, the question is, how are you at humbly serving others? Do you serve others primarily so that they can repay you? Or do you serve others because you want to set for them an example of how God has served you by sending Jesus to die on the cross? Maybe you haven't acknowledged that yet in your life. Maybe you haven't ever taken the steps needed to become a Christian. This morning is a perfect opportunity for you to do that. This morning is a perfect opportunity for you to make that statement that you want Jesus to be Lord of your life, and that you want to follow him, and that you want to be his disciple. Maybe you've made the commitment, or you've made that commitment, but you haven't exactly lived up to it. What are you going to do with Jesus? You can let him stay a distant way from you, or you can invite him closer. You can bring him closer. You can start serving him again. Maybe you need to make a private response. Maybe you need to make a public response for prayers of this church family. Whatever that response is, whatever it's for, however you need to acknowledge that Jesus is your Lord this morning, won't you do that? If we can help you through a public response, won't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together?